Andrew Yang was recently at a Bloomberg roundtable where he had some interesting remarks to say about the Iowa caucus. He said that he wouldn't be surprised if a number of his supporters ended up voting for Bernie Sanders in later rounds of the Iowa caucus. And he also said that he sees that there is a lot of overlap between his supporters and the supporters of the progressive Vermont senator. Now, I also want to show you a clip from a later interview, also with Bloomberg, and then we're going to come back and talk about it.
Lastly, you've become this phenomenon. I mean, a year ago, no one had ever heard of you.
Joe. It's very
now
nice
you're now you're this nationally known name. Every day, there's another viral video of you, whether it's at a gospel chorus or dancing at a senior center, and people are sort of captivated by you. You're extremely popular. If that popularity doesn't translate into the White House, do you have a vision for how either you or the sort of Yang Gang movement that is built up behind you could continue to press your interests after this campaign?
The problems that have animated me and the Yang Gang are just getting bigger and stronger. And to me, my job is to help solve them and make sure that your kids and mine actually grow up in a country that we're excited to pass on to them. I think I can do the most effective job of moving our country in the right direction as president, but I'm not going anywhere because the problems aren't going anywhere and your kids and my kids aren't going anywhere.
So you plan to continue to be a public figure regardless of whether that's in the White House or not?
I just want to help solve these problems, Joe. Frankly, if someone else were solving all these problems and I could just kick back and hang out with my kids, that would be great. I don't have some intrinsic desire necessarily to like boss around lots and lots of people. I mean, if things were getting done in a really, really high level way and I could just applaud like the rest of American citizens, that would be tremendous. But unfortunately, that's not the country we live in. That's why I'm running. And as long as that stays the case, and I think I can contribute, I'll still be here doing my best.
So you just saw there Andrew Yang saying that he would be interested in continuing a career in politics, some kind of path in politics, even if he ultimately doesn't win the nomination. I think when you combine that with the fact that he just said that he would be interested, or he does see a lot of overlap in support between his supporters and between Bernie's supporters. Something which I saw I think 2 Reddit posts on this already is Yang more or less saying, hey, look, even if I don't win the nomination, if I don't ultimately make it, and Bernie, you do, I would be interested in being in your cabinet. I would be interested in being in your administration in some way or another. Maybe he's saying that. I don't know. Now, look, I know there are some progressives out there, and maybe you're one of them, who aren't necessarily the biggest fan of Andrew Yang. Maybe, you might support Bernie, you might be a progressive, but you don't necessarily like Andrew Yang personally. Look, I'm a progressive and I'm a Bernie supporter, but I do really like Andrew Yang. I really, really like Andrew Yang. But I think, though, the interesting thing which these questions, these sort of recent comments that he's been making raise is, why is it the case that there's an interesting overlap between Bernie supporters and between Yang supporters? And, I think the sort of obvious observation is, look, they're both anti-establishment candidates. They're both sort of outsider candidates, and, they sort of see things similarly in that respect. But I also think it's actually a little bit deeper than that. I think the fundamental problems which they both see in society are ultimately really, really similar, right? So one of the things which I really respect about Andrew Yang is that even when I disagree with him, even when I don't ultimately agree with him on the policy issue, I'm ultimately forced to accept his framing and forced to accept the way that he conceptualizes the problem. I'm forced to use his terms of debate in a sense, right? So so a few areas where I disagree with Andrew Yang. I disagree with him on the issue of healthcare. Especially, he sort of changed his mind a little bit, flipped a bit on the thing about Medicare for all. I disagree with him when it comes to the issues of public colleges. I believe in free public colleges and universities, and I disagree with him on some of the sunset clauses for regulations, and there are a few others. But let me take the example of colleges, right? Even when I'm arguing against Andrew Yang on the issue of colleges, I'm forced to accept his framing, right? Because his whole thing is, look, his 2 central problems, which he's sort of illustrates his campaign, is finding meaning in work, and as a result of the coming issue of automation, right? That's essentially how he sees the problems in society. And he's like, look, college doesn't ultimately do anything to address that problem. And so he's like, well, we're giving you UBI, and if you want to go to college, you can. Instead, we're supporting these issues with trade schools and the like. And so ultimately, even when I'm objecting to him, I'm forced to sort of grapple with the way that he sees the world. And I really respect that. And I think that the way that he sees the world is actually similar to how Bernie sees it. Let me go into his issue of UBI in order to sort of really explain what I mean by that. I think there's essentially two positive arguments for UBI, two sort of affirmative ways which you can argue for UBI. There's a kind of compensatory account for it, and there's a kind of ethical account. Now, on the compensatory account for UBI, this is sort of the automation account, right? This is, we're trying to compensate you, trying to pay you back for the creation of a world under which your labor may not any longer be needed, right? We're creating this economy, creating this society in which a lot of people's work, the kinds of things which they're able to contribute to the economy, won't really be needed in the coming 150 years. And, with all the automation, all the robots and the like. And in this sort of worldview, in this perspective, one of the sort of central features of that is that it generally sees this creation as inevitable, right? It was necessary and it was needed that this world was created in order to remain competitive on the global market. It's an issue in itself with capitalism. Even though Andrew Yang is in some sense like pro-business, pro-market, he sees himself as, in some respects, critiquing capitalism in a rather profound way. But the second argument for UBI is a kind of ethical argument, right? So he said the ethical argument is, we're trying to raise people out of poverty. It's trying to compensate people for poverty itself rather than just the kind of causes of poverty, as the case in the compensatory argument. It's about, sort of paying people. It's not paying people back for some kind of materially determined loss, such as the loss of a job, but sort of paying you for the kind of immaterial value which, sort of permeates human life, whatever flowery language you want to use. There's a kind of ethical account for why we should implement UBI. Now, the really interesting thing, though, is that these two arguments for UBI have precisely opposite meanings, or precisely opposite accounts when it comes to accounting for the meaning of work in life, right? So you'll notice on the compensatory account, there isn't any intrinsic value when it comes to work, and no intrinsic value when it comes to having a job, right? We can just pay you back for the fact that you lost your job ultimately. Now, on the ethical account, though, it's precisely the opposite. Work has intrinsic value because it's precisely the way in which we pay for this UBI program. So they both have opposite accounts when it comes to paying for when it comes to accounting for the meaning of life. And the way that Andrew Yang, the thing that I really respect, the way that he really sort of walks the tightrope between accounting for meaning of life, is that he does see this deep connection between these ideas. And so, he's laying out in many respects an ethical case for why universal basic income is good. And he uses then the compensatory argument to argue why we should do it now rather than, in 20 years and 50 years, because he does ultimately see it as inevitable. So he's really merging these two arguments together in a really coherent way. And by the way, that's why he talks about changing the statistics, right? We need to change the statistics away from GDP, to use a better account which accounts for the meaning of work. One of the things which he always talks about is how his wife is at home taking care of his special needs son, and how we need to really account for that kind of labor, and how GDP and the various statistics which we use don't account for the ways in which we ultimately live our lives. And so the real problem which we are facing in society, Andrew Yang argues, is a kind of meaninglessness when it comes to work. There's a meaninglessness which it comes to work, and it's ultimately just going to escalate with the rise of robots and with the rise of jobs and with the loss of jobs because of automation. And on the thing of Bernie Sanders, which, by the way, there's actually a number of clips which you can find of Bernie Sanders saying that he does support UBI, or at least he says that he's sympathetic to it. He said that many times, but that was years and years ago. There are multiple clips which you can say where you can find where he does say that he's sympathetic to it. Hey guys, so I'm over here editing this video, and I've realized that one of the points which I've not made sufficiently clear is that where I see Bernie and Yang really interconnecting, where I see their ideas, their worldviews really merging, is that they both believe that the market is finally an institution. They reject the idea that politics should exist to serve the market, right? You sort of prune it, you prune the market like a garden so that it grows in the proper way, and that's what ultimately benefits the people. Both Andrew Yang and Bernie Sanders want to turn that idea on their heads. One of the things which Andrew Yang talks a lot about is how, when you build prisons, you build F-35 bombers, those things add to the GDP, but they don't add to the people. Instead, we should be building schools and hospitals. Those are the things which really help people. And, that entire conception of politics, which Andrew Yang and Bernie Sanders both share, in at least that respect, is where I see the ideas merging. And they're really the only two people on the field which have that conception. I mean, with the slight exception of Tulsi Gabbard, who does seem to have this view when it comes to foreign affairs, when it comes to military intervention. She does believe in taking on the military-industrial complex and turns it on its head in that area of things. But in any case, I just wanted to make sure that I was making that point clear. But anyway, back to the video. But when you talk about his federal jobs guarantee, for instance, a lot of people talk about them as mutually exclusive, right? There's UBI and then there's the federal jobs guarantee. Which one do you do? Ultimately, though, when you think about it this way, they're in some respects asking the same question, right? They're really doing the same thing. The jobs guarantee is, look, you're going to be losing your job, but we're going to give you a job. We're going to give you work to do. And then on the case of UBI, it's, well, look, we're paying you for the fact of being a citizen. But I think Andrew Yang, what he would say to Bernie Sanders on the federal jobs guarantee is, well, look, we can give you a job, but does that really matter if the job that you're doing, the work that you're ultimately doing, isn't really necessary? If a robot could do that job for less, and we're only giving you that job because, we just give people jobs, will giving someone a job really account for the fact that there's meaninglessness in work? Now, you can agree more or less with the federal jobs guarantee. I actually do support the federal jobs guarantee. I think that it's a really good move, but I would also support a UBI program. But I do think that, you could look at a situation where, in 100 years, a federal jobs guarantee might not make sense. I think it still makes sense now and possibly for the next 50 years, maybe even next 70 years. But you could look at a genuine situation where it just wouldn't make sense because robots could do all the kinds of jobs which you could quickly train people for in the case of like a federal jobs guarantee, and it ultimately wouldn't be a kind of long-term solution. So that's sort of one of the central disagreements between Yang and Bernie in that respect. But again, I think that Andrew Yang sees the world, sees the structural problems in capitalism as very similar. I mean, Bernie Sanders, as we all know, famously is a democratic socialist, right? He sees capitalism as, in some sense, really, really problematic for how we think about authority, how we think about structure, and so we need to democratize the workplace in order to have meaning in life. They do have slightly different accounts of how we can find meaning in capitalism, find meaning in work. Andrew Yang thinks that we can change change the statistics and change the numbers which we use to account for it. And change the way that we think about capitalism itself. Bernie Sanders thinks that, we should democratize ultimately the workplace and move towards, in some ways, none of the actual policies which he's proposing in his campaign does this, but some of his campaigns, for instance, like, putting workers on boards is starting to move in the direction of a post-capitalist society, which I'm here for personally. I know you may not, you might disagree with that personally, but I would be open to having that debate one day. We should have that. I should make a video about that sometime. But in any case, I just wanted to talk about that a little bit. And I do think that it's an interesting discussion to be had. And I'm here for, by the way, I'm definitely here for having Andrew Yang on a cabinet on, some capacity in a Bernie Sanders administration. Anyway, I've sort of gone on a bit of a tangent. So if you like the video, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button and consider subscribing. Thanks.